They called him the last great Prime, a warrior, a scholar, a mentor to Optimus. But behind the title was a fracture waiting to break. Before the betrayal, before the war, Sentinel Prime was the symbol of Cybertronian pride. Its past, its power, its preservation. He wasn't just the leader of the Primes. He was the one they all looked to when hope began to fade. When the war first ignited between Autobots and Decepticons, Sentinel stood firm, unyielding, calculated, commanding. To Optimus, he was a father in all but name, the torchbearer of the Matrix, the voice of what leadership was supposed to be. But here's the truth most never ask. Was Sentinel Prime always a protector? Or was his obsession with control merely waiting for the right crisis to reveal itself? Even in peace, his vision of Cybertron was cold, ordered, efficient, absolute. He admired freedom, but he trusted systems. And when those systems collapsed, when the war stole everything, something inside him cracked. He began to see mercy as weakness, dialogue as delay, and his student Optimus as too fragile to finish the war. That's when the shift began. Not with rage, but with reason. The logic of tyranny, wrapped in the language of survival. Sentinel wasn't corrupted overnight. He was built that way. A Prime forged in order, tested by war, and undone by the burden of being Cybertron's last hope. The logic of tyranny, wrapped in the language of survival. Sentinel wasn't corrupted overnight. He was built that way. A Prime forged in order, tested by war, and undone by the burden of being Cybertron's last hope. The fallen hero's burden. To most fans, Sentinel Prime is remembered as the ultimate betrayer, the mentor who turned on Optimus, the Prime who sided with Megatron. But was he really just a villain? Or was Sentinel's fall the result of a burden no leader could carry? Before the war consumed Cybertron, Sentinel was more than a name. He was a living relic of the Golden Age, the last of the old guard who remembered the planet before the scars. He had witnessed the loss of the Allspark. He had watched the planet's energon fields turn to ash. He had stood on the bridges of Iacon, while cities fell like stars extinguished in the night. Every Prime before him had carried the mantle of leadership, but by the time it reached Sentinel, the mantle weighed 1,000 times heavier. He wasn't just fighting Megatron. He was fighting time itself, a dying world, a starving people, a culture eroding in real time. And as one of the last living Primes, the responsibility to save Cybertron was no longer a calling. It was a sentence. Sentinel believed Cybertron's survival was more important than any code, more important than any principle. Because principles, to him, were luxuries of peace, and peace was gone. This was his tragic dilemma: sacrifice ideals for survival, or let his people perish, upholding a code they could no longer afford. He began to tell himself that compassion was naive, that the covenant of Primus was outdated, that Optimus's idealism was dangerous. And every time another city fell, every time another Autobot was lost, Sentinel's desperation deepened. In Sentinel's optics, Cybertron wasn't just dying, it was already dead. And he alone had the power to pull it back from the brink. That's how tragedy begins. Not with hatred, but with the belief that only you can save the world. The Faustian bargain. In every war, there comes a moment when a leader looks into the abyss and asks, What am I willing to become to save what I love? For Sentinel Prime, that moment came when he made a deal with the devil, and his devil was Megatron. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't madness. It was calculation. He saw in Megatron not a monster, but a tool. Together, they could rebuild Cybertron, not through diplomacy or peace, but through domination. He didn't want to save Cybertron. He wanted to control its future. In Dark of the Moon, Sentinel returns not as a savior, but as a strategist. His betrayal of Ironhide, instant, cold, surgical. His justification, the same as every tyrant in history. The ends justify the means. Sentinel believed that the enslavement of Earth was a necessary evil, its resources used to resurrect his world. What is one planet when weighed against the extinction of his entire race? And so, he compromised. First, his ethics. Then, his honor. Finally, his soul. This is where tragedy becomes tyranny. Because Sentinel never saw himself as evil. He saw himself as the last hope. But in doing so, he betrayed everything the Prime stood for. The Matrix had once chosen him. But when it mattered most, he chose power instead. Sentinel Prime didn't fall. He stepped down willingly into the shadows. Not because he was corrupted, but because he believed the light had failed him. A kingdom divided. Sentinel thought he was saving Cybertron. But in choosing domination, he fractured the very world he swore to protect. When a Prime betrays his own, it doesn't just divide an army, it shatters a belief system. Sentinel wasn't a rogue agent. He wasn't some radical faction. He was the standard, the one every Autobot had been taught to emulate, the voice behind the ancient codes, the very symbol of what a Prime meant. So when he sided with Megatron, the Autobots didn't just lose a leader, they lost their moral anchor. Optimus, once the student, was now forced to confront a horrific question. What if the very foundation of your morality was built on a lie? What if Sentinel's teachings were never about justice, but about order at any cost? The emotional collapse was just as brutal as the military one. Commanders second-guessed every mission. Veterans questioned whether they'd been pawns all along. Young soldiers born into war watched their ancient protector turn into a tyrant. The army didn't splinter. It hollowed out from within. It wasn't the Decepticons that broke the Autobots that day. It was doubt. The humans, already skeptical of Cybertronian loyalty, watched as their supposed ally executed Ironhide without hesitation. Earth wasn't a battlefield. It was a checkmate. Sentinel's arrival was supposed to bring hope. Instead, it brought occupation. His orders were immediate. You will obey. You will build. You will restore Cybertron, whether you like it or not. Even Megatron, as power-hungry as he was, began to recognize something chilling. He hadn't gained a partner. He had unleashed a competitor. Because Sentinel didn't just want to rule. He wanted to rewrite everything. And still, in his optics, he wasn't the villain. He was the last adult in the room, making the hard decisions the younger generation was too soft to face. He dismissed Optimus's faith as naivete. He dismissed Earth's sovereignty as irrelevant. And he dismissed the concept of freedom as a myth unfit for survival. By trying to resurrect Cybertron, Sentinel Prime buried everything that made it worth saving. He split the Autobots in heart, in mind, in loyalty, not through violence, but through betrayal in the language of salvation. And when the battle began in Chicago, the stakes were no longer just control of Earth. It was a war for the soul of Cybertron's legacy. He didn't just divide a kingdom, he dismantled the very myth of what it meant to be a Prime. And in the eyes of his people, Sentinel Prime became the warning, not the example. Legacy of despair. Sentinel Prime's name should have been carved in Cybertronian stone, but instead, it echoes like a warning. After his death at the hands of Optimus, the war did not pause for mourning. There were no memorials, no elegies, no remembrance, because Sentinel's legacy wasn't one of wisdom, it was of wounds. For Optimus, the weight was unbearable. He hadn't just killed a traitor, he had killed a father figure. The very mech who once taught him to wield the Matrix, now silenced by the very same hand he helped mold. Imagine being forced to destroy the one who shaped your ideals. Because those ideals became a mask for tyranny. Among the Autobots, some were haunted, others quietly angry, not just at Sentinel, but at themselves, forever believing he was anything more than a symbol. Trust shattered, morale fractured, and in that silence, a dangerous question lingered. If a Prime can fall, what does that say about all of us? On Earth, humanity's trust in the Autobots, already fragile, began to erode. They had welcomed Sentinel with open arms. He responded with annihilation. Ironhide's execution, the forced labor, the near destruction of Chicago. To many humans, the line between Autobot and Decepticon had blurred beyond repair. Cybertron didn't rise. Earth didn't heal. All Sentinel left behind was a scar. And yet, his shadow remained. Because every Prime after him, every speech Optimus gave, every sacrifice made, was haunted by the question, how do you lead when your own mentor became the monster? The matrix of leadership, once a symbol of divine wisdom, now carried a whisper of doubt. Not because Optimus was unworthy, but because Sentinel had once held it too. He wasn't mourned. He wasn't celebrated. Sentinel Prime became a void, a legacy no one wanted, but no one could ignore. And sometimes, that is the heaviest burden a leader leaves behind. The question that haunts every Prime. Every Prime carries the weight of legacy. But what happens when that legacy is fractured by one of their own? Sentinel Prime's downfall wasn't just personal, it was existential. Because if a Prime, chosen by the Matrix, forged in the fires of war, and trusted by the annals of Cybertronian legend, could fall so completely, then what does that say about the very idea of what a Prime is? Was the Matrix flawed? Was the covenant of Primus blind to ambition? Or is leadership itself destined to bend beneath the weight of impossible choices? Optimus Prime never spoke of these questions out loud, but you could see the answers in his silence, in how long he stared into the stars after every battle, in the tremble beneath his strength, in the sorrow baked into every word. He knew. The galaxy no longer saw the Primes as flawless gods. So, they saw them as fragile sparks, capable of greatness and of failure. Because Sentinel's betrayal didn't just stain his name, It corrupted the very ideal of what a Prime was supposed to be. No longer just guardians of wisdom. They were now seen as rulers with too much power and too little accountability. So now, every Prime who follows must live with that shadow, the whisper in their mind. What if I become him? What if one day I break? And that is what makes Optimus a different kind of leader. Not because he never questioned, but because he did every single cycle. Because he looked into the abyss where Sentinel fell and chose to keep walking. He carried the burden not to glorify himself, but because someone had to. This is the curse of the Matrix. It does not choose perfection. It chooses those willing to be broken for the sake of others. And Sentinel Prime was the reminder that even the brightest spark can burn everything to the ground. So the question remains, is a Prime defined by their power, or by their restraint, by what they conquer, or by what they refuse to become? And when their story ends, will their name be etched into legend or burned into warning?